Okay, let's jump right in. We're looking at a genuinely fascinating methodological crisis in how we read one of the most famous, and let's be honest, most widely debated texts in human history, the Bible. How we actually piece this thing together doesn't just dictate some abstract theology, it literally shapes the worldview of billions of people. For centuries, scholars have argued over how to properly interpret its 66 books, and today we're going to explore a really compelling framework that attempts to solve this massive, complicated puzzle. It really all boils down to one fundamental question. Is the Bible one unified story, or is it just a disconnected anthology? For over 2 centuries, modern academic scholarship has increasingly viewed it not as a single narrative, but as a heavily fragmented collection of conflicting traditions. But in today's explainer, we are unpacking an alternative to this fragmentation, drawing directly from the work of biblical scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr. and this brilliant concept he calls the promise plan. To solve this mystery, here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the fragmented Bible problem. Second, the flaws in classical systems. Third, Kaiser's promise plan alternative. Fourth, the question of whether the prophets actually knew. And finally, tracing the cosmic story. So, Section 1, the fragmented Bible problem, a methodological crisis. How did we get to a place where the text feels so broken apart? Well, under modern historical critical paradigms, mainstream scholarship started treating the Bible like a stitched-together, fractured document. They argue that Messianic prophecies weren't actually original predictions at all. Instead, they see them as late projections, basically retrospective edits retrofitted onto texts that originally had zero Messianic content. This approach completely strips the text of a unified original purpose, viewing the Old and New Testaments as just this evolutionary, disconnected set of religious developments. Moving to Section 2, flaws in classical systems, imposing external rules. Now this right here gets to the absolute core of our explainer today. To fix that fragmentation, conservative systematic theologies tried to step in and rescue the text's unity, but they created their own set of problems. On one side, you have classical dispensationalism, which rightly preserves literal promises to ethnic Israel, but it chops the story up into isolated, disconnected administrative ages, giving Israel and the church completely separate destinies. It introduces massive discontinuity. On the flip side, classical covenant theology correctly emphasizes a unified plan of salvation, but it risks supersessionism, meaning it often spiritualizes away the concrete, physical land and temple promises made to Abraham, basically treating the New Testament church as a wholesale replacement for Israel. Both systems mean well, for sure, but their reliance on external frameworks developed long after the canon was closed perfectly sets the stage for Kaiser's alternative. Which brings us to Section 3, Kaiser's Promise Plan Alternative, a text-immanent center. So, if the modern academic reading is way too fragmented and the classical systems are just too rigid and external, what's the alternative? Walter C. Kaiser Jr. introduces the Promise Plan. This is an organic center that emerges directly from the final canonical form of the text itself, rather than projecting some external grid onto it like those classical systems did. Kaiser argues for a single, progressive, and cumulative divine declaration. The Greek word is apangelia, or the promise. It's one continuous thread from Genesis all the way to Revelation, completely 100% centered on the Messiah. Let's look at how this builds organically over time. Following the insights of Willis J. Beecher, Kaiser shows how this singular promise isn't just a bunch of random, disconnected proof texts scattered around. It's a cumulative stream. It starts right at the initial fracture of sacred space in Genesis 3:15 with the protoevangelium, the promise of a seed who's going to crush the serpent. Then it narrows to Abraham in Genesis 12, adding a universal blessing and a physical land. It specifies a royal lineage through Judah, and finally, in 2 Samuel 7, it elevates to a perpetual Davidic throne. The promise is kept alive through very specific historical links, dynasties, families, covenant. It's like this one massive growing architectural structure. Section 4. Did the prophets know? Prophetic consciousness. This brings up a huge detective question. And honestly, it's one of the most hotly debated topics in hermeneutics. Did the ancient prophets actually know they were writing about a future Messiah? To answer that, we have to look at this concept called sensus plenior, which translates to a fuller sense. Some scholars really embrace this. They argue that God basically placed a secret, deeper code into the Old Testament text that pointed to Christ. Under this view, the ancient prophets were completely in the dark. They were acting as mere mechanical instruments, kind of like someone burying a time capsule without having any idea what's inside it, just waiting for New Testament writers to come along later and unlock the hidden code. The promise plan framework completely rejects this hidden code theory. Why? Because if the meaning bypasses the human author's consciousness entirely, it can't really be called written human scripture in a historical sense. Instead, Kaiser gives us this wonderful analogy. The prophets were highly conscious composers. They absolutely knew the principal redemptive melody they were writing, even if they couldn't foresee every single historical circumstance of its final performance. To back this up and preserve grammatical historical exegesis, Kaiser draws on literary theorist E.D. Hirsch. Think about the distinction this way. Meaning is your anchor. It is stable and permanently fixed to what the human author intended to say when they physically wrote it down. New Testament writers aren't out there inventing new meanings or unlocking some Da Vinci Code. But significance? That's like the growing plant. It is the variable, dynamic, unfolding, living reality of that fixed meaning as the promise plan actually plays out in history. And we have explicit proof of this prophetic consciousness right in the apostolic testimony, specifically 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter tells us flat out, the ancient prophets weren't blind typewriters. They searched intently, and they consciously knew 5 distinct theological realities. 1. They knew they wrote of the Messiah. 2. His predicted sufferings. 3. His subsequent glory. 4. The exact historical sequence that suffering had to come first. And 5. That their writings were meant for future generations. They completely understood the what, they were just searching for the when. So the absolutely crucial point here is consistency. Kaiser points out a 19th century critique by Alexander McCall regarding a massive double standard we often use. Think about the logic here. If we demand strict, literal, historical fulfillment for prophecies about the Messiah's suffering, like the literal crown of thorns, we can't just suddenly shift our hermeneutics and spiritualize the prophecies about his glorious earthly reign and his concrete promises to Israel. You can't have it both ways. This consistency is exactly how the promise plan provides such a brilliant alternative to those classical systems we discussed earlier. It honors the literal text across the board. Section 5. Tracing the cosmic story. A supernatural worldview. Now, let's zoom out a bit. If this is a single, conscious, unfolding promise, we need to see how this unified plan actually matters on a cosmic scale. But to truly grasp this, we've got to bridge a major epistemological gap. As modern readers, we naturally use Western analytical logic, right? We want quick, neat, systematic resolutions to any tension. But the Bible operates in an ancient Hebraic cognitive environment. This is a narrative method that is perfectly comfortable presenting complementary or even paradoxical realities side by side, like divine sovereignty and human responsibility, or the special election of Israel living right alongside universal blessing for all nations. We basically have to leave our rigid Western logic at the door to appreciate the dynamic tension of the text. When we do that, we see that the promise plan is actively responding to a deeply supernatural cosmic crisis. It's not just about the fall in Genesis 3. It's about reversing 3 very specific cosmic rebellions. First, the rebellion in Eden, which caused the loss of sacred space. Second, the transgression of the Watchers in Genesis 6, which introduced unlawful heavenly intervention and deep moral decay. And third, the disinheritance at Babel, where rebellious nations were judicially assigned to lesser divine beings, while Yahweh selected Abraham as his own. The promise plan is literally the Creator's determined counteroffensive to disarm these rebellious spiritual powers and restore humanity. And this beautifully brings us full circle, resolving those flaws of the classical systems we saw earlier. Because the promise plan is one continuous trajectory, it creates a single continuous people of God. Gentile believers are graciously grafted into Israel's existing olive root. This includes the Gentiles in the cosmic rescue mission, but, and this is vital to Kaiser's non-supersessionist alternative, it does so without abolishing or spiritualizing away the concrete, irrevocable promises given to ethnic Israel. The historical particularity of Israel and the universal scope of redemption for the Gentiles are perfectly, seamlessly united. No separate destinies, no replacements. So we've seen that the Bible isn't some fragmented anthology, and it certainly doesn't require artificial frameworks forced upon it from the outside. It is held together by an unbreakable organic unity, the promise plan. As we look at this victorious divine story to redeem a multi-ethnic family and restore a cosmic temple, we are left to wonder, how does our own modern worldview align with the ancient Song of the Prophets? Are we reading the music they actually wrote, or are we trying to play a completely different tune? Definitely something to think about as you dig deeper into the text yourself.